A police officer walked into a quiet diner one rainy night, just to grab a bowl of soup and some silence. But within minutes, he was fighting for his life, ambushed by 3 men sent to kill him for digging too close to a buried secret. Just when it should have been over, a battered old German shepherd limped in from the storm and did the unthinkable, took down all 3 attackers in seconds. He had no collar, no owner, but carried the scars of a warrior and the eyes of someone who had seen everything and survived. Who was this dog? Why did he protect the officer? What they uncovered together will break your heart and then rebuild it stronger than before. What happened next will make you cry and believe in second chances again. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. Hopeville, Colorado. Late November. A cold drizzle slicked the empty sidewalks, the kind that made tires whisper against wet pavement and turned the air sharp with the scent of pine, iron, and coming snow. Inside Clara's diner, a weathered building on the edge of Main Street, yellowed light flickered behind foggy windows, barely visible through the mist. It was the kind of night that swallowed sound. At the far end of the diner, in a red vinyl booth that had seen better decades, Ethan Carter, 38, sat alone. Broad-shouldered and quiet by nature, Ethan wore his Hopeville police jacket zipped to the throat, shoulders damp from the rain. His hair was dark brown, neatly trimmed, with strands of silver starting to show at the temples. Gray eyes, set deep, scanned the laminated menu out of habit more than interest. Ethan wasn't just a cop. He had been federal once DEA, then interagency task forces. But 5 years ago, after a botched operation cost a friend his life, Ethan came home to Hopeville. Not to heal, he never fooled himself into believing that, but to anchor himself to something still real. The badge he now wore on his chest was simpler, smaller, but heavier in ways he didn't always admit. The diner was nearly empty. Behind the counter stood Clara May, the owner and cook, a wiry woman in her late 60s with iron-gray hair pinned in a messy bun. She moved with the precision of someone who'd done this routine for 40 years. Clara was thin, wiry, with knobby elbows and a permanent squint. She was known for 3 things: strong coffee, stronger opinions, and surviving a lightning strike when she was 15. She treated all her customers like family, or like unruly nephews who didn't deserve second helpings. "Soup's hot and the world's cold. Eat up before one of 'em kills you," Clara muttered as she slid a steaming bowl of beef stew in front of Ethan. "Thanks, Clara," Ethan replied with a nod, voice gravelly. The bell above the diner door jingled. Ethan didn't look up right away, but something about the silence that followed the sound made him freeze. 3 men entered. They didn't take off their coats, didn't look at the menu, didn't glance at Clara. The first was tall and brawny, wearing a black peacoat over tactical pants. His buzzed hair and stiff posture screamed military, but his eyes were too flat like glass over wrought. The second was lean, twitchy, with scars on his knuckles and a lip that curved into a near-permanent sneer. The third man, younger, kept his hands in his hoodie pocket and glanced around too much, like a crow sniffing for carrion. Ethan's instincts stirred. He quietly shifted his weight, right hand resting on the edge of his seat. Clara, sensing the change, slowly stepped back behind the counter. "You fellas need coffee?" she asked, voice tighter than usual. The twitchy one shook his head. "We're just here to deliver something." Ethan rose halfway from the booth when the tall one reached into his coat. "Gun? Knife? Something worse?" They moved all at once. The lean man lunged toward Ethan's table, flipping it sideways in a clatter of ceramic and broth. The youngest tried to swing around from behind. The tall one pulled a switchblade curved, gleaming under the diner lights. Ethan ducked, rolled, kicked a chair into the path of the first attacker. But he was cornered, outnumbered, and his sidearm still holstered under his coat was seconds too far away. That's when it happened. A low growl split the air like a crack of thunder. The diner door hadn't opened. It had slammed inward with the force of something desperate. From the rain-slick darkness, a blur of fur and teeth launched through the entrance like a bullet from a gun. A dog. Large, muscular, though clearly aged. A German shepherd. Coat sable with streaks of silver, one ear bent downward, back right leg stiff from an old injury. His ribs showed faintly beneath matted fur, and he moved with a limp, but only when walking. In combat, he was a storm. Shadow, though Ethan didn't know the name yet, moved like a ghost from another war. He hit the tall man first blade, never even raised jaws, snapping down on the forearm with brutal force. The man screamed and collapsed backward into a table. The second attacker turned, only to receive a flying paw to the throat. He crumpled against the window, shattering a salt shaker on the floor. The youngest tried to run. Shadow spun, snarled, and launched forward, not to maul, but to pin, his front paws slamming the man's chest into the linoleum, teeth inches from his neck. Ethan, now free to move, drew his weapon. But he didn't need to fire. The fight was over in 9 seconds. The diner was still again. 3 attackers groaning on the floor, one of them crying. Clara behind the counter, hand on her chest. Ethan standing with his gun lowered, eyes locked on the animal panting in front of him. And Shadow standing over the last man, unmoving but unblinking. "Jesus," Ethan whispered. Shadow turned to look at him, just once, and in that gaze brown eyes full of some ancient grief there was recognition. Not of Ethan, but of purpose. This wasn't random. This dog had known who to protect. Clara slowly stepped out, now holding a battered first aid kit. "That dog," she whispered. "He's been hanging around the old train station for weeks. Thought he was just scavenging. But, Lord, that ain't no stray." Ethan knelt slowly, offering his hand. The dog didn't growl, didn't flinch. He walked forward, deliberate, and placed his paw scarred and dirty into Ethan's palm. Like a soldier reporting back for duty. Ethan stood outside Hopeville Police Department just after midnight, rain misting down in fine silver threads. The air still carried the tension of what had just unfolded. Behind him, the diner was now cordoned off, and the paramedics were tending to the attackers, bruised and groaning, but alive. The German shepherd, his unlikely savior, stood by Ethan's side, quiet, soaked to the bone, but alert. Not aggressive, just watching. The station was a squat, aging building with green trim and a single flickering lamp over the front door. Ethan nudged it open with his shoulder, holding the door wide. "Come on," he said softly. The dog hesitated, then stepped in, paws wet against the linoleum. He limped slightly, but his head stayed high. That walk calculated, efficient reminded Ethan of every dog he'd seen working beside agents in the field. Inside, the front desk was manned by Officer Dana Reyes, a compact woman in her late 20s with curly dark hair pulled into a high bun. Her frame was athletic, her eyes sharp and sleep-deprived. She had a reputation for being blunt but reliable. Raised by a single father who worked construction and taught her how to box by the age of 12, Dana didn't rattle easily, but when she saw the blood on Ethan's coat and the dog beside him, her brows jumped. "Jesus," she muttered, getting up from her desk. "You okay?" "I'm fine. 3 men tried to take me out at Clara's. This dog stopped them." Dana glanced down. "He doesn't look like a stray." Ethan crouched beside the dog, brushing aside the wet fur on the left ear. There it was, just barely visible under years of grime and weather, a faded, tattooed code, K9 107. Dana stepped closer. "That's federal. You think he's one of the old DEA units?" Ethan nodded slowly. "I think he used to be." The dog made no noise. His breathing was steady. His tail didn't wag, nor did he shrink back. He stood like he belonged in the room, like this was routine. Ethan had seen canines before. He'd worked with them. This one had training. Not just tricks, he had instincts, situational awareness, muscle memory. "Let's check the database," Ethan said, rising to his feet. They moved into the back office, Shadow trailing behind. On the wall were framed photos of the officers long gone and a dusty file cabinet that hadn't been touched in years. Dana booted up the terminal and tapped into the old interagency K9 registry. It was slow, outdated, but still connected to federal archives. Ethan handed her the code. K9107. Check inactive units, declared deceased. She typed, eyes scanning. Bingo, she said, pointing. K9 Unit Shadow, assigned to Agent Marcus Delaney, DEA, Denver Division, officially declared KIA during Operation Emberline 5 years ago. Ethan's chest tensed. He knew that name. Marcus Delaney had been a field agent, steady, moral, sharp. They'd worked 3 operations together and nearly died in one. Ethan had left federal service not long after Delaney was reported killed during a warehouse ambush in Phoenix. There had been fire, chaos, and it was assumed Shadow died alongside him. But that wasn't true. Shadow had survived. Somehow. I knew Marcus, Ethan said quietly. He never went anywhere without this dog. Dana turned to him, frowning. So how the hell did Shadow end up here? I don't know, Ethan murmured, but I'm going to find out. He crouched again, meeting the dog's gaze. Shadow, he said. The dog lifted his head slightly. Sit. Shadow obeyed. Down. The dog laid down slowly, stiffly, but without confusion. His eyes never left Ethan's. Dana whistled low. Still remembers his commands after all these years. That's not muscle memory. That's loyalty. Ethan reached into the supply locker, grabbed a towel, and began drying Shadow's fur. The dog didn't resist. As he worked, he felt the raised ridges of old scars, the roughness of skin that had seen heat, cold, and time. He's not just loyal, Ethan said. He's a survivor. A knock at the back door startled both of them. Ethan's hand moved to his sidearm by instinct. Dana went to check. It was Dr. Sarah Trent, the town's on-call vet. Mid-40s, tall and lean with streaks of gray in her auburn hair, Sarah carried a medical kit and wore a windbreaker over jeans and boots. Known in town for her calm demeanor and volunteer work, she had once served with a veterinary unit overseas. Her time in war zones had left her quiet, often haunted, but deeply empathetic, especially toward animals others had given up on. I heard about the attack, she said as she stepped in, and the dog. Clara called me, said he was limping. Ethan nodded. His name's Shadow. He's K9. Thought to be dead. He saved my life tonight. Sarah knelt, pulled out a small penlight and a soft muzzle just in case. Shadow didn't flinch when she examined him. He didn't resist. In fact, he leaned slightly into her touch when she found the injury on his back leg, an old fracture that had never healed properly. This was never set, she said softly. He's been walking on pain for years. Shadow looked up at her, panting softly. I'll get him some antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, and a proper wrap. He needs food, water, rest, and someone to stay with. I'll take him home, Ethan said immediately. Sarah gave him a long look. You sure? He saved me. Feels like the least I can do. Sarah nodded, then leaned in and whispered something to Shadow, something Ethan didn't catch, but whatever it was made the dog blink slowly and rest his chin on her knee. By the time she left, Shadow had a fresh bandage, a warm blanket, and a bowl of water placed beside Ethan's desk. He didn't sleep. Not yet. He just watched, like he was still on duty. The morning after the attack came gray and bitter, with wind sliding in sharp gusts across the hills around Hopeville. The rain had frozen overnight, leaving the sidewalks glazed and treacherous. Ethan stepped out of his truck with Shadow close behind, his paws crunching softly on the thin layer of ice. The dog moved slower today, his limp more noticeable after the long, bruising night before, but his eyes remained alert, head turning constantly as if scanning each alley, each passing car. The body of one of the attackers, now identified as Vincent Greer, had been transferred to the county morgue. The 2 others, still unconscious the night before, were cuffed to hospital beds in Evermore General. Ethan had gone over Greer's effects that morning, sifting through the evidence bag until he found something strange. It was a folded piece of heavy brown paper, water-stained, with partial smudges of blood across the corner. It had no writing, no labels, just a greasy thumbprint and the faint outline of a symbol that looked like a compass rose. The type sometimes used by smuggling rings. Ethan showed it to Shadow. The dog sniffed the paper, his ears twitching. Then, to Ethan's surprise, Shadow turned and began to walk. Not with uncertainty, but with clear direction. The trail began near the edge of town, where the industrial district had slowly died over the last decade. Ethan drove slowly. Shadow in the passenger seat, head low, but eyes focused. When Ethan reached the rusted fence of the old lumber yard, Shadow lifted his head and barked once, sharp. Ethan got out and unlocked the gate. The yard was abandoned. Half the structures caved in, weeds pushing through cracks in the concrete. At the far end stood a warehouse, its windows boarded, the padlock on the side door rusted but broken. Ethan drew his gun before stepping inside. Shadow slipped through first, silent as smoke. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and cold. Shelving units lay toppled, sawdust clung to the floor. Ethan swept his flashlight across the space until he spotted a row of wooden crates tucked into a back corner, too clean for a place this neglected. Shadow padded forward, sniffed around the edges of the crates, then suddenly halted. He growled low, a quiet rumble. His nose pressed into a narrow crack in the crate's side. Ethan pried it open with his multi-tool. Inside wasn't wood or tools. It was plastic wrap bundled in bricks the size of paperback novels. Some marked with blue spray paint, others unmarked. Drugs, a lot of them. Ethan exhaled through his nose. So, that's what this was about. Shadow circled the crate and pawed at the back wall. Curious, Ethan moved closer and noticed one of the boards was newer than the rest. Less warped, slightly misaligned. He tapped it with his knuckles. Hollow. He pried the plank loose. Inside was a rolled-up map, sealed in a plastic sleeve. Ethan pulled it free, unrolled it on the floor under his flashlight. It was a transportation route from Hopeville to El Paso with marked junctions, waypoints, even restocking stops. But what stood out was a series of red X marks. One of them was only a few miles from Hopeville. He snapped photos with his phone, slid the map back into the sleeve. Shadow suddenly barked. Ethan spun around. At the far side of the warehouse, a silhouette darted past a broken window. Ethan gave chase. "Stay!" he shouted at Shadow, but the dog didn't listen. Despite the limp, he bolted forward, skidding on the wet floor but regaining balance instantly. The suspect's slim build, dark hoodie leapt over the low fence behind the warehouse. Ethan followed, breathing hard, cutting through a narrow alley lined with discarded tires. He turned the corner just as Shadow lunged. The dog tackled the suspect, dragging him to the ground and pinning him with practiced precision. Ethan arrived seconds later, weapon drawn. The man under Shadow was young, early 20s, pale, shivering from the cold. His eyes were wide with panic, lips chapped. I was just paid to watch the place," he stammered. "I don't even know what's in the crates." Ethan cuffed him, recited his rights. He noted the tattoo on the inside of the man's wrist, a stylized compass rose, same as the symbol on the paper. Back at the station, Dana ran prints and confirmed the man's identity. Nathan Bell, minor record, previous charges for petty theft and drug possession. Local, a runner. Ethan leaned over the table in the interrogation room, watching Nathan sweat under Shadow's unblinking gaze from the doorway. "Who hired you?" Ethan asked. "I don't know his name, just a guy, comes in a black SUV, says I stay quiet, I get paid. Told me the place wasn't safe anymore." Ethan showed him the map. Nathan's face drained of color. "I've seen that," he admitted. "The guy said if I ever saw anyone asking questions, I should disappear." Ethan closed the file. "Well, too late for that." Later that night, after Nathan was processed and locked up, Ethan sat in his office with the map rolled out again. Shadow lay nearby, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but ears perked at every sound. "Looks like we just stepped into something a whole lot bigger," Ethan said softly. Shadow didn't move, just exhaled, slow and steady, like he'd known all along. Snow fell quietly over Hopeville the following afternoon, a soft dusting that covered rooftops and sidewalks in white. Main Street moved at its usual sluggish pace. Storefronts half decorated for the upcoming holidays, the bakery sending out wafts of cinnamon, and school buses humming along the slushy roads. On the surface, it looked like a peaceful town preparing for winter. But Ethan knew better. Inside the police station, the mood was different. Tense. Since the warehouse raid, there had been whispers agents from the state had called, files were being quietly reviewed, and someone had tipped off the press. Officer Dana Reyes sat hunched at her desk, going over arrest reports, her eyes flicking up every time the door opened. Shadow lay nearby, watching the room with the same steady calm, his head following each person who walked by. Jerry Harper entered late. He was in his mid-30s, medium build, with a well-trimmed goatee and a tightly clipped fade. Jerry had always been charismatic, the kind of officer who slapped backs, remembered birthdays, and volunteered to grill at every fundraiser. He wore his uniform crisp, boots polished, badge gleaming, but lately, Ethan had started to notice something behind the grin. The way his eyes scanned the room a beat too long. The way he asked a few too many questions about Ethan's investigation. That afternoon, when Jerry stepped inside the main bullpen, Shadow immediately lifted his head and growled. Not loud, not aggressive, just low and sustained, like a warning bell from somewhere deeper than instinct. Jerry paused. "Easy there, boy. Didn't mean to step on your tail." But Shadow didn't stop. His ears pinned back, body still, eyes locked onto Jerry's face. Ethan stood slowly from his desk, eyes narrowing. "Jerry," he said calmly, "where were you last night between midnight and 2 a.m.? The man blinked. "Excuse me?" "We ran into a runner at the warehouse, Nathan Bell. He said someone had warned him Hopeville was getting hot." Jerry gave a little laugh, trying to wave it off. "You think I'm mixed up in that crap? Come on, Ethan." Shadow didn't move. Dana looked up, frowning. Ethan didn't answer right away. He leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "I'm just asking." "I was home," Jerry said, "watching the game. You can ask my girlfriend." "Already did. She said you left around 11. Didn't come back until 3. The room went quiet. Jerry's smile faded. "So, now I'm under investigation?" Ethan didn't say yes. He didn't have to. The dog already had. Later that day, Ethan watched Jerry drive off in his department-issued cruiser. 10 minutes later, he climbed into his own truck with Shadow beside him and took a different route, one he hadn't used since his days in surveillance. He followed from a distance, turning off his headlights when the sun dipped low. Jerry didn't go home. Instead, he took a winding road out past the high school, through an old service lane that bordered the train tracks. He parked behind a locked gate with a private property sign and disappeared inside. Shadow growled again, this time shorter, sharper. They waited. After 20 minutes, Jerry emerged with a small black duffel bag and a phone pressed to his ear. Ethan snapped pictures through the windshield. Jerry climbed back in and drove off without noticing the truck parked beneath the tree line. That evening, Ethan reviewed the surveillance footage from the past few nights. One clip stood out, taken from a traffic cam near the warehouse. It showed a cruiser passing by slowly. The timestamp matched the night before the raid. The cruiser's number? H-43, Jerry's. The next morning, Ethan didn't go to the station right away. He went to the local elementary school, arriving just after the bell. Children poured out, laughing, backpacks bouncing. Among them was Lily Saunders, a shy 8-year-old with strawberry blonde hair and a coat too big for her frame. She was the girl who'd once brought Shadow a sandwich and a blanket when he was still a stray. Lily's mother had died the year prior. Her father worked long hours at the mill. Most days, Lily walked home alone. That morning, she glanced across the street and froze. Jerry was there, leaning against his cruiser, watching. Ethan parked fast and walked across. Shadow leapt from the truck before Ethan had even opened the door fully, his body language tense. Jerry looked up, surprised. "Ethan, just saying hi to the kids." "You don't have kids." "Yeah, well, they're the future." Shadow moved in front of Lily and growled louder than he ever had before. Ethan saw the way the girl clutched her bag and took a step back. Shadow stood between her and Jerry, unmoving. "Get away from her," Ethan said coldly. Jerry shrugged, hands raised, stepping back. All right. No need to be dramatic." Lily ran to Ethan and wrapped her arms around his coat. That was the moment Ethan stopped doubting. Back at the station, he filed an emergency search request for Jerry's vehicle. Inside the trunk, beneath a false floor, they found burner phones, envelopes of cash, and a detailed copy of the map Ethan had recovered from the warehouse. Jerry was arrested that evening. As officers read him his rights, Ethan stood nearby, Shadow by his side. The dog didn't bark, didn't growl, just stared. Jerry looked at them both and muttered, "That dog's a damn demon." Ethan replied, "No, he just knows who the monsters are." The air in Hopeville turned sharper with each passing day, a cold that seeped deeper than weather. It was the kind of chill that came when truths began to surface, when layers were peeled back to reveal rot beneath polished smiles. Ethan had known corruption ran deeper than Jerry Harper, but he hadn't imagined how high the roots reached until now. In the days following Jerry's arrest, the department entered lockdown. Files were audited, personnel reassigned. Officers walked on eggshells. Ethan barely slept. Shadow, ever watchful, never left his side. It was on the third night, just past midnight, that Shadow began pacing the perimeter of the small office Ethan had claimed in the back of the station. The dog's ears were erect, nose twitching toward the window as though something in the wind was tainted. That was when Dana Reyes knocked. She was in her late 20s, Latina, slender and sharp-eyed, always calm, always deliberate. Dana had been quiet since the bust her younger brother had died from fentanyl 2 years prior, and her hatred for the drug trade was personal. She carried a thin manila folder and a face like stone. "Got something," she said, setting the file down. "Came across this in the old storage archive, marked confidential. Didn't come through our standard logs." Ethan flipped it open. Inside were scanned records from 5 years ago. K9 Shadow's original handler, Agent Micah Boone, had filed reports warning of cartel infiltration into Hopeville's civil infrastructure. 2 months later, Boone had gone missing during a solo sting operation. His body was never recovered. Shadow had been listed as lost in action. But what chilled Ethan wasn't the report. It was the signature approving the case closure. Mayor Richard Abrams. The same mayor who now stood at the helm of Hopeville, praised for cleaning up the town, launching new housing initiatives, and hosting community fundraisers. A man in his early 60s with a square jaw, silver hair neatly combed back, and the polished charisma of a preacher. Abrams had always seemed untouchable, smiling in every photo op, shaking hands with veterans, even awarding Ethan a civic medal the year prior. Dana looked up. He buried this. Ethan closed the folder slowly, and he erased Shadow. But hearsay wouldn't be enough. Not against a man like Abrams. The next morning, Ethan and Shadow returned to the warehouse this time, to follow up on a trail that hadn't been there before. They checked every floorboard, every vent. Finally, behind a false panel inside a rusted locker, Shadow pawed at something metallic. Ethan pried it loose. A GPS tracker and a burnt phone. Shadow barked twice short and firm. Back at the station, Dana traced the GPS log. One of the most recent coordinates led to a remote hunting cabin near the northern woods, a location off any patrol grid. Ethan, against protocol, didn't report it to HQ. He just loaded Shadow into the truck and drove out. The cabin was small and weathered with peeling green paint and a warped porch, but what mattered wasn't the exterior, it was the man who stumbled out when Shadow barked. He was in his early 40s, gaunt, stubble-ridden, clothes stained with ash and oil. A jagged scar ran across his neck, and one eye twitched nervously when he saw Ethan's badge. His name was Caleb Nixon, known associate of a meth ring taken down 3 years prior. Ethan drew his gun. "You're a long way from town, Caleb." Caleb raised his hands. I didn't come back for trouble, just laying low. Then explain this. Ethan tossed the tracker toward him. Caleb's face drained of color. He started shaking. I didn't know they were still watching it. Shadow stepped forward, growling low. That was when Caleb cracked. All right. I was just the runner. I handled the pickups, okay? There's a drop next week. 2 trucks, in the quarry yard behind Pine Ridge. I swear it's all I know. And the boss? Ethan asked coldly. Caleb hesitated. Shadow growled louder. You wouldn't believe me if I told you, he whispered. It's Abrams. Mayor Abrams. He runs it all through shell companies, charity fronts. Anyone who gets too close, they disappear, like that Fed Boone. And the dog. He looked at Shadow with a mix of awe and fear. They said the dog went feral. But that ain't no feral dog. That's a soldier. Ethan's grip tightened on his gun. He wanted to arrest Caleb on the spot, but instead, he cuffed him, read him his rights, and drove him in with Shadow sitting silently in the back seat beside the man like an avenging shadow. Back at the station, Ethan handed the interrogation to Reyes. An hour later, she emerged pale but determined. It's true, she said. Abrams used his office to erase Boone's file, and he's behind the supply routes. Caleb gave us access codes, maps, everything. We can set up a sting. Ethan looked at Shadow. The old canine didn't wag his tail. He didn't bark. He just sat beside the door, as if waiting for the next command. The wind howled across the outskirts of Hopeville, stirring sawdust and decay around the abandoned lumber mill. It had once been the heartbeat of the town's industry, but now it stood like a carcass at the edge of the forest, its broken windows and rotting walls a perfect place to hide rot of another kind. Ethan Cole knew it was time. The tip from Caleb Nix had led here, a single, final shipment, a gathering of what was left of the Operation 7 men, hardened and dangerous, the cartel's stateside arm, and tonight they were going down. Ethan crouched beside a stack of rusted metal drums, the moonlight painting streaks across his face. He wore plain black tactical gear, a bulletproof vest snug under his jacket, his service pistol holstered low for quick draw. His eyes scanned the mill, every broken slat and hanging tarp, but it was the presence beside him that kept his breath steady. Shadow. The German shepherd moved low and silent, his sable and silver coat blending into the night, one bent ear twitching at every shift of wind. 10 years old, but every sinew in his frame moved with the discipline of a soldier. His brown eyes locked on Ethan, waiting for the signal. Inside the mill, through a pair of binoculars, Ethan could see the 7 men. 2 were on the upper walkway, one asleep with a rifle in his lap. 3 others sat at a poker table near a stack of cash and bundled bags, probably drugs. Another loaded crates into the back of a black panel truck. The last leaned against a concrete pillar, flipping a butterfly knife open and closed with idle menace. The plan was simple. Swift, silent entry. Cut the power. Isolate. Dismantle. Ethan whispered into his radio. Reyes, hold your perimeter. No move until I say. Copy, came Dana Reyes' voice. She was stationed down the road with 2 backup cruisers, lights off, engines cold. She'd wanted to come in with Ethan, but he refused. Shadow was enough. Ethan tapped the side of his boot. Shadow moved. The dog vanished into the dark, paws silent across gravel and broken boards. Moments later, there was a low thump from the north wall, a circuit box clanging open. Then darkness. The inside of the mill went black. Shouts rang out. Flashlights flicked on, swinging wildly. Ethan surged forward. He climbed through a busted window and dropped silently behind a stack of pallets. 2 men near the poker table had drawn pistols but pointed them at Shadows. One turned just as Ethan fired. The shot echoed loud. The man went down with a grunt. The second spun and fired blindly toward Ethan's cover. That was when Shadow struck. He launched from the shadows, teeth sinking into the man's wrist. The gun clattered to the ground. The thug screamed, but Shadow didn't let go until Ethan gave the order. the mill erupted in chaos. One of the men on the upper walkway tried to radio out, but the static was dead. Ethan had jammed their signal. A third man charged with a crowbar, and Ethan ducked, swept his legs, and brought him down hard. Across the room, Shadow chased another who tried to bolt through the loading dock, dragging him down before he reached the door. The only one left was the man with the butterfly knife. He stepped out from behind a pillar, calm despite the noise, and clapped slowly. "Well," he said, voice smooth and southern, "I gotta hand it to you, Officer Cole. One man and a dog. Impressive." Ethan raised his gun. "Hands up, on your knees." But the man just smiled. "I knew Abrams was sloppy. Should have put him out of commission years ago." He moved fast, flinging the knife at Ethan's face. Ethan ducked, fired, missed. The man lunged. Shadow roared. The dog hit the man mid-torso, sending him crashing into a pile of crates. They rolled, dog, man, snarls, fists, boots. The man pulled a hidden pistol, aimed at Ethan. Shadow clamped down on his forearm and yanked. The gun fired once, the shot going wide. Ethan rushed in, tackled him from behind, and slammed his head into the floor. It was over. Reyes and the team entered moments later, flashlights sweeping through the carnage. 7 men, all alive, all in cuffs. Ethan knelt beside Shadow, checking his fur for wounds. There was blood, but it wasn't his. Shadow licked Ethan's glove, tail wagging faintly. "You saved my life," Ethan murmured. Reyes crouched beside him, her face pale with adrenaline. "That dog isn't just smart, he's trained. Deadly trained." Ethan nodded. Shadow wasn't just a canine, he was elite. She looked around at the scattered weapons, the crates, the sealed bags. "We've got enough here to bury the whole network, including Abrams." Shadow sat quietly in the middle of the mill, surrounded by the ghosts of the operation he'd helped dismantle, his ears upright, his breathing steady. No longer a forgotten asset. Tonight, he was a partner. The air in Hopeville buzzed with an electricity Ethan hadn't felt in years. News of the final raid at the lumber mill had spread like wildfire. Local media played the security footage on a loop. Ethan, with his gun raised, Shadow springing from the dark like a ghost of justice. Across diner counters and living rooms, people whispered one word with awe: Shadow. The state police arrived within 48 hours. Leading them was Captain Marion Blake, a stern woman in her early 50s with short-cropped silver hair and a rigid spine that told of years in command. Her eyes were sharp, but not unkind, and when she shook Ethan's hand at the station, she didn't waste time with small talk. "We've reviewed your reports. The evidence gathered at the mill is ironclad," she said, her voice low and efficient. "More importantly, we've traced financial transfers back to Mayor Abrams, offshore accounts, laundered funds. He's the spine of this snake." Ethan nodded. "And the head." But it wasn't just about arrests anymore. The people had seen everything. Shadow had become a local legend overnight. At the cafe downtown, old ladies knitted scarves with the dog's face on them. Kids chalked his name onto sidewalks. One teenager spray-painted a mural on the alley behind the firehouse Shadow, poised mid-leap, eyes locked on justice. But it was the petition that changed everything. Started by a young woman named Lily Connor Slender, with straight auburn hair and an earnest fire in her voice. The campaign demanded that Shadow be reinstated, posthumously honored, and given the title stripped from him 5 years ago. Lily had a quiet resilience, the kind born of surviving hardship. Shadow had once protected her, silently trailing her home from school, snarling at the man who meant her harm. Now she fought back for him. The petition gained 100,000 signatures in less than a week, which led to the courtroom. It was not a trial in the traditional sense. The evidence was overwhelming, and Abrams had been arrested without incident. But it was a formal hearing, to finalize sentencing, to present the case to the public, and to address the motion to reinstate Shadow as an official canine. On the morning of the hearing, Hopeville Courthouse overflowed with spectators. Retired officers, veterans, parents, teachers, teens with camera phones all gathered in solemn silence. Outside, American flags fluttered. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and smoke, the ghosts of a town both wounded and healing. Ethan stood in full dress uniform, polished badge over his chest beside the courtroom doors. Shadow sat calmly at his side, wearing a deep blue vest with a silver badge stitched over the heart. A bailiff approached. "They're ready." They entered the courtroom. Inside, sunlight poured through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wood floor. The judge, Honorable Dolores Niven, a sharp-tongued woman in her 60s with steel-gray eyes and a no-nonsense robe, presided from the bench. "Bring in the defendants," she ordered. Mayor Abrams was led in first, his once proud posture slumped, the smugness drained from his face. His tailored suit couldn't hide the weight of shame. Behind him followed the 6 remaining gang members, shackled and silent. But when Shadow entered, the room stood. Not a single word spoken. The old German shepherd walked beside Ethan, ears alert, tail steady. His coat caught the light silver streaks glowing like medals. His scarred leg barely slowed him. Judge Niven regarded him for a long moment. "This is the dog?" she asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Ethan replied. "Former K-9 unit, Federal Narcotics Division. Declared MIA during a failed mission. Recently found and proved he was never truly lost." The judge nodded once and looked down at Abrams. "Mayor, do you have anything to say before sentencing?" Abrams stood. He began, but his voice faltered under the weight of hundreds of eyes. Shadow growled, low and deep, a sound like thunder rumbling through the earth. Abrams sat back down. The judge smirked slightly. "Noted." She slammed her gavel once. "I hereby sentence Jeremiah Abrams to 25 years without parole for conspiracy, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. The remaining 6 defendants are sentenced to 15 years each, plus restitution for community damage and victim compensation." Applause broke out, not from celebration, but relief. Then Judge Niven turned to Ethan. "Officer Cole, regarding the petition for reinstatement of Shadow's K-9 status—" She paused, scanning the crowd, her voice rising. "It is the judgment of this court that Shadow be formally recognized for his service. He is no longer missing. He is no longer forgotten. He is a veteran, a protector, a hero." She banged the gavel again. The room erupted. Shadow tilted his head slightly, as if puzzled by the sound, but Ethan whispered, "They're clapping for you, partner." Outside the courthouse later, reporters jostled for position, and Lily was there, standing next to a banner that read, "Welcome home, Shadow." She knelt and wrapped her arms around the dog's neck, whispering words no one else could hear. Captain Blake approached Ethan, holding a folder. "I think we both know Shadow's earned more than just a title." Ethan opened the file. Inside, a proposal to retire Shadow with honors. A pension, a ceremonial collar, and a lifetime of care guaranteed by the state. Ethan looked down at Shadow. I think he already chose his home. That night, back at Ethan's small house on the hill, the air was still. Shadow curled up by the fireplace, his badge hanging over the mantel. Ethan sat beside him, a glass of warm bourbon in hand, eyes locked on the flames. They didn't need words. Some battles are fought in silence, and some victories speak for themselves. The late autumn air in Cedar Grove was crisp with change. Golden leaves swirled around Ethan's boots as he stood in front of the courthouse steps. Shadow sitting at his side, calm as ever. The townspeople had gathered in silence, circling the empty pedestal that had stood for years, waiting for a name worthy of permanence. Today, it would no longer stand empty. As the cloth fell, revealing the life-sized bronze statue of Shadow mid-stride ears alert, one paw raised, his scarred hind leg cast in perfect detail, the crowd erupted in applause. Below the statue, etched in silver letters, "The light in our darkest night." For the first time in a long while, Ethan allowed himself a full breath. Not one laced with suspicion or sorrow. Just quiet pride. The story of the fallen K-9 turned hero had traveled beyond Hopeville's borders. Journalists had come and gone. Shadow's photo appeared in veteran newsletters, law enforcement bulletins, even on the morning news. But Ethan hadn't cared for the press. He cared about the after. Weeks had passed since the trial. The town had begun to heal. Mayor Abrams' arrest shook the foundation, but also sparked unity. Donations flowed in from grateful citizens. Retired officers and veterans reached out with letters, some even showing up at Ethan's property, a few with dogs of their own, some with hollow eyes and twitching hands, seeking something they couldn't name. Ethan knew what they were searching for. That's when the idea came. He cleared out the back half of his property, a quiet stretch of field behind the rusted container home where it all began. With the help of Ben Lott, the limping mechanic who once refused to look Ethan in the eye, and Sarah, the widowed schoolteacher who had turned her grief into kindness, the land was transformed. Sarah, in her early 40s, was tall and willowy with silver-streaked black hair always pinned in a loose knot. Her voice was soft but certain. She had lost her husband to PTSD, and though she rarely spoke of him, the pain lived just beneath her gentle smile. It was she who suggested the name, the Watchdog Program. The Watchdog Program offered training not just for dogs, but for their handlers. Veterans, retired officers, and at-risk youth partnered with rescues and retrained canines. It wasn't therapy, at least not officially, but every time a young rookie calmed his shaking hands while holding a leash, or a veteran who hadn't spoken in months gave a simple, "Stay," Ethan saw hope. Shadow, now 11, remained the soul of the program. Though older, he still moved with quiet purpose. The puppies in training followed him like children trailing an elder monk. When one barked too much or got distracted, Shadow would gently shoulder them back into place. It was instinct, yes, but it was also choice. He had learned trust again, and now he taught it. The program wasn't without resistance. One afternoon, while training behind the barn, a burly man in his 50s showed up. Corporal Troy Wilkins, a recently retired officer from another county, stood arms crossed, jaw locked tight. He had a brindled mutt on a short leash, the dog snapping and snarling. "This program's too soft," he grunted. "Dogs need discipline, not coddling." Ethan walked up slowly. "That mutt's got more trauma than teeth, and you're scaring the spirit out of him." Wilkins snorted. "And you? What makes you an expert?" Ethan only nodded toward Shadow. The old shepherd rose, walked forward, and sat directly in front of the mutt. No growl, no bark, just presence. The mutt froze, lowered his head, and stopped trembling. Wilkins said nothing, but the next morning he returned, quiet, humbled, and asked where to begin. One evening, as a gentle rain fell over the valley, Ethan sat with Sarah on the porch. Shadow dozed at their feet. The lights inside the training barn still glowed faintly. They watched a group of teenagers. One of them, Marcus, had once tried to steal from the grocery store guide a rescued pit bull through an obstacle course. Sarah took a sip of her tea. "Do you think we're making a difference?" Ethan glanced at Shadow, then at the barn. "I think we're planting something that takes time to bloom." She smiled. "Like that dogwood tree you keep forgetting to water?" He chuckled. "Exactly like that." The night of the statue unveiling, Lily stood on stage to give a short speech. She wore a white dress with red buttons, her auburn hair pulled back with a ribbon. She held a microphone in one hand and a small blue box in the other. "Shadow saved me when I was too scared to save myself," she said. "He doesn't know what awards mean, or newspaper articles, but I hope he knows what love feels like, and gratitude." She opened the box. Inside, a custom silver collar plate gleamed under the spotlights. It read simply, "Guardian of Hope." With Ethan's help, she knelt and fastened it around Shadow's neck. The dog didn't flinch or fuss. He simply licked her hand once and sat by Ethan's side. The applause that followed wasn't explosive. It was reverent, like a hymn. That night, back at home, Ethan lit a candle beside the old photograph of his late wife. The frame still bore the dust of war, the corner chipped during their final move. He whispered, "You were right. I wasn't meant to be alone." He turned and looked out the window. where Shadow stood in the moonlight watching over the barn, the gatekeeper, the guardian, and the light in their darkest night. Sometimes the hands of angels are not feathered or glowing. Sometimes they walk on four legs, scarred and silent, with eyes that have seen darkness and still choose to protect the light. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was a vessel of second chances, of unseen grace. In a world that had given up on him, God had not, and through him, hope found a way to return, to a broken town, a wounded man, and a generation in need of healing. We often look for miracles in thunder and lightning, in grandeur and gold. But perhaps God whispers through the quiet loyalty of a dog that never turned away. Shadow reminded us that redemption doesn't bark loudly. It stands watch at the door, patiently, faithfully. In our own lives, we may not be canine handlers or heroes, but we are all gatekeepers of hope in someone else's life. Maybe through a kind word, an open heart, or simply not giving up. And just like Shadow, we can be someone's miracle. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Comment below with your thoughts. Type Amen if you believe that God still works through unlikely messengers. Subscribe for more stories that restore faith in the goodness around us. And may God bless you and protect the shadows that watch over your life.
Elderly veteran flying with his canine German Shepherd pilot tries to kick them off, but the winter morning air was sharp and still inside the regional airport terminal in the Midwest. A faint scent of coffee and de-icing fluid hung in the air, mingling with the distant murmur of gate announcements and the rustling of coats. At Gate 14, the boarding area was quietly tense, staring out through frost-lined windows at the tarmac beyond. Among them stood Walter Briggs, a 72-year-old retired United States Marine. He wore a thick brown coat over his worn uniform jacket, the edges of a faded purple heart ribbon barely visible beneath the collar. His right leg dragged slightly as he walked, a remnant of an old spinal injury from a convoy attack in Helmand province. Beside him, moving with precision and poise, was Remy, an 8-year-old German Shepherd. Once a military working dog in Afghanistan, now Walter's certified post-traumatic stress disorder support companion. Remy wore a vest with clearly marked patches. Service dog, do not pet, post-traumatic stress disorder support. His eyes never left Walter, his gait perfectly in sync with the veteran's. Together they approached the gate counter, where a young attendant smiled, then hesitated as she glanced down at Remy. "Good morning," Walter said quietly, handing over his boarding pass. "Final flight home." The attendant nodded. "Thank you for your service, sir. I just need to check with the captain." She picked up the phone. Moments later, the cockpit door opened, and out stepped Captain Mason. Tall, rigid, and clean-shaven, he wore the crisp authority of a man who followed rules to the letter. His eyes swept the boarding area, then landed on Remy. "That dog will have to go in cargo," Mason said flatly. "We cannot allow animals that size in the cabin. It is against policy." Walter blinked. "He's not a pet. He's a service animal. I have documentation." "It does not matter," Mason interrupted. "If he blocks the aisle or creates a safety concern, I have final authority to deny boarding." Passengers nearby turned to watch. A few frowned. A mother hugged her child closer. Walter's hands trembled slightly. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the worn papers. Remy's certification, his doctor's note, even a copy of the Americans with Disabilities Act guidelines. "Please," Walter said. "He alerts me before I black out. Suddenly Remy's ears shot forward. He rose onto his haunches, nose pressed urgently to Walter's waist. The dog let out a low whine, his posture changing, every muscle tightening with precision. Walter took one more step, and his knees buckled. Gasps rang out as Walter's body began to collapse, but Remy moved like lightning. With practiced grace, the dog slid his body beneath Walter's falling frame, cushioning the blow, lowering him gently to the floor. Then he barked once, twice, sharp, commanding barks that echoed through the terminal. People jumped, Phones rose. The gate attendant screamed for medical. Remy stayed rooted, one paw on Walter's chest, licking his face, his body a barrier between the veteran and the cold tiles. A small moan escaped Walter's lips as he fought to stay conscious. EMTs rushed over, kneeling beside them. "Is he diabetic?" one asked. "No," someone else said. "It's a stroke, or something close." Remy did not move. His gaze locked on the medics, but did not growl. He simply stayed close, his breathing calm, eyes alert. Captain Mason stood a few feet away. His arms, once crossed in command, dropped to his sides. He stared not at the dog, but at the way Walter's hand, weak and shaking, reached up to rest against Remy's shoulder. Remy leaned in and gently licked Walter's forehead. The gate was silent. Something in the air had shifted. Captain Mason's face, once stone, had softened. Not a word left his mouth. Not yet. The flight was delayed just long enough for medics to evaluate Walter. A mild stroke, they said. Nothing life-threatening, but a warning. He needed rest, monitoring, and most importantly, stability. Walter insisted on continuing his trip, and with medical clearance provided on site, he was allowed to board. This time there was no protest. Captain Mason stood silently as Walter approached the plane again. Remy walked beside him, head held high, like a sentinel returning to duty. The other passengers watched now not with suspicion, but with awe. An attendant helped Walter to his seat in the front row, giving him room to stretch his stiff leg. Remy settled at his feet, his massive body curled tightly, yet alert. His eyes scanned the cabin, but every few seconds they flicked upward toward Walter. As the aircraft taxied onto the runway, the engines whined, and a subtle tremble passed through the fuselage. Walter's hand gripped the armrest, his breath caught, shallow and fast. Then he felt it. Remy's body pressed gently against his calf, grounding him. "I'm all right," Walter whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The seatbelt light blinked off. The passengers around him began to relax. A woman 2 rows back leaned forward and said, "Is he always this calm?" Walter turned, the corner of his mouth twitching into a smile. "Only when I am not." A little girl across the aisle, no older than 6, peeked over her seat. She clutched a stuffed animal in one hand, the other trembling. Her father whispered something, but she hesitated. Then, with uncertain steps, she crossed the aisle. "Can I pet him?" she asked, barely audible. Walter nodded. "Only gently. He's working, but he won't mind." Remy lifted his head slightly, his tail thumping once against the floor. The girl reached out and stroked the top of his head. Her breathing slowed. She smiled. "My name's Ellie. I don't like flying," she whispered. Walter looked at her, then at Remy. "He doesn't either, but he always gets me home." Minutes passed. The girl returned to her seat, calmer than before. Walter rested his head back and closed his eyes. The hum of the engines became a lullaby, and memories stirred beneath the surface. He remembered the first time he saw Remy, barely a year old, ears too big for his head, bounding awkwardly between handlers at the training compound in Kandahar. He was too wild at first, too energetic, but the trainers saw something in him, a hunger to serve, to protect. Walter had resisted bonding. After 2 tours, he had lost too many friends, human and canine. But Remy had not cared. One night, under the blistering desert sky, their convoy was ambushed. Amidst the smoke and gunfire, Walter had been thrown from his vehicle, pinned under debris. He never heard the footsteps, but he felt the breath hot, urgent on his face. Remy had pulled at his jacket, barked until the others found him, stood guard as they loaded him onto the chopper. That night, Walter stopped calling him the dog. From then on, he was Remy. Now, years later, in a steel tube soaring above the clouds, that same dog kept watch, not over a battlefield, but over a weary old soldier who had seen too much and spoken too little. Captain Mason stood in the galley, watching. He had said nothing since the incident at the gate, But now, as he glanced down the aisle and saw Remy resting his head gently on Walter's boot, and Ellie sleeping peacefully against her father's side, something in his expression changed. It was not surrender, not yet, but it was the beginning of understanding. The cabin lights had dimmed to a soft blue. Outside the window, the sky had turned ink black, a velvet curtain pierced with distant stars. Most of the passengers dozed in their seats, cradled by the soft hum of the engines and the occasional jolt of turbulence. Walter was half awake, his chin tilted forward, one hand resting gently on Remy's back. The dog did not sleep. He never really did. His ears twitched at every change in engine pitch, every click of a buckle, every muffled cough. Then it happened, from row 19, a sudden thud, followed by the clatter of a metal cup hitting the floor. Heads turned. A woman gasped, "Harold?" A man in his late 70s slumped sideways in his seat, his chest heaving once, then falling still. His eyes were open, but empty. His wife shook him, her voice rising. "Help! Please! Someone help!" A flight attendant rushed down the aisle, fumbled for the intercom. Passengers began to stand, blocking the way. And then Remy moved. In a blink, the German shepherd sprang to his feet, slipping free from under Walter's hand. He bounded down the aisle with urgency but not panic, weaving between legs and bags with uncanny precision. His bark cut through the confusion, short, sharp, commanding. The crowd parted. Remy reached the collapsed man and immediately lowered his body beside him, nose pressed to the man's face. He sniffed twice, then barked again, louder this time. Walter, now fully alert, stood with difficulty and called out, "Heart! It's his heart!" Remy's head snapped toward the approaching flight attendant. Without hesitation, he reached for the hem of her sleeve, tugging it gently but insistently, guiding her hand toward the man's chest, then to his jacket pocket, motioning, almost pointing. The medic kit was in there. Nitroglycerin. Remy had smelled it. The woman's eyes widened. She obeyed. Another attendant came running with the emergency bag. "We need to line him flat. Pulse is weak." They followed every cue from the dog. Oxygen, monitor, compressed chest. Time passed in strange, slow motion. Through it all, Remy remained still, eyes locked on the man, reading him as if watching a fellow soldier fall in battle. Finally the man stirred. His fingers twitched, his eyes fluttered and focused. "He's stabilizing," the medic whispered. The old man's wife sobbed in relief. Her hand reached out, and Remy pressed his face gently into the man's open palm. The man's lips moved faintly. "Thank you, warrior." The entire cabin had gone silent. Every breath was held, every movement frozen. Then a voice, soft but awed, broke the spell. A young flight attendant, standing at the front of the plane, said aloud, "He's not just a dog, he's a soldier." Whispers rippled through the cabin. Walter stood in the aisle, one hand gripping the overhead bin for balance. He looked at Remy, then at the passengers, who now saw the dog not as a nuisance, but as something rare, necessary, sacred. Then his gaze shifted and met Captain Mason's. The captain had stepped out from the cockpit during the commotion. He stood by the bulkhead, arms at his sides, no longer crossed with judgment. He had seen it all. Remy returned to Walter's side, brushing against his knee before sitting again, chest proud, eyes still scanning. Not for approval, not for praise, for duty. Captain Mason spoke for the first time in hours. His voice was quieter than before. What kind of training did he go through? Walter gave a tired but proud nod. Military canine unit, explosives, trauma response, field medical assistance. He served 2 tours. The captain did not speak again, but his gaze lingered, longer this time, and softer. The wheels touched down with a heavy thud, jostling the cabin as the plane sped across the slick runway. A light winter drizzle had begun outside, casting halos around the airport lights. As the plane taxied to the gate, passengers stirred, gathering bags, murmuring softly about what they had just witnessed. Walter remained seated, his body heavy with fatigue, his hand resting on Remy. The dog sat tall beside him, calm and alert as always. He had not slept the entire flight. He did not need to. His job was never done. The overhead chime signaled it was time to disembark. One by one, passengers shuffled out. Some nodded at Walter. Others gave Remy a silent smile or a gentle touch on his back. They were no longer just a man and his dog. They were something else now. Symbols of something people could not quite name, but deeply felt. As Walter stepped into the jet bridge, his knees stiff, he saw Captain Mason waiting just outside the cockpit door. His uniform was immaculate, his posture rigid, but there was something in his eyes. Less steel, more storm. "Mr. Donovan," Mason said, his voice measured. "May I have a word?" Walter gave a slow nod and paused, Remy stopping obediently at his heel. "I just got off a call with the airline supervisor," Mason said. "There was a complaint filed, about me, about how I handled your boarding." Walter did not blink. "I am not surprised. I may be asked to submit a written report," the captain added. "Possibly disciplinary action." Walter looked at him for a long moment. Then, without anger, he said, "You said he was too big, too much of a risk. But I say, he is the reason I am still here. He saw what no one else did, including you." Captain Mason's jaw tightened. He glanced down at Remy, whose gaze remained steady, unreadable. "You served?" Walter asked softly. The captain nodded, slowly. "Air Force, one tour, logistics. I never saw front-lump combat." "I did," Walter replied. "And so did he." He placed a hand on Remy's back. "We lost good men out there, but I came home with this one. Remy's more than a dog. He is a memory, a mission, a reason. When the world goes quiet, he hears the storm before it comes." Mason's eyes flicked between the man and the dog. His breath hitched just slightly. "I was following policy." "I understand," Walter said. "But sometimes the rule book forgets to leave room for the heart." The captain took a step forward. He knelt awkwardly, not quite used to the movement. Slowly he extended a hand toward Remy. Remy stared at him, unmoving. For a moment there was hesitation. Then, as if sensing the unspoken shift in the air, the dog leaned forward and gently licked the captain's hand once. It was not obedience, it was acknowledgement. Around them, the corridor had gone silent. A few passengers had stopped to watch. No one spoke. No one needed to. In that moment, a veteran, a pilot, and a dog stood together, not in uniform, not in war, but in something rare, understanding. Captain Mason rose, brushing his hand against his pant leg, more shaken than he let on. He looked once more at Walter, then at Remy. "Maybe we all need a Remy in our lives," he said, voice low, "to show us what we could not see ourselves." Walter gave a small smile. "Some of us get lucky." And with that, man and dog continued down the terminal, the world a little quieter behind them, but somehow a little softer too. 1 month had passed since the flight that changed everything. Winter had begun to thaw into spring, and the small town of Willow Creek, Illinois, had invited local veterans for a special event, Veteran Appreciation Day at the community elementary school. Children filled the auditorium, their faces bright with anticipation, paper flags in their hands, and curiosity in their eyes. Among the guests was Walter Donovan, wearing a clean but worn Marine Corps jacket, his silver hair combed back. At his side, tall and regal as ever, walked Remy. His black and tan coat gleamed, and the soft clink of his tags echoed lightly with each step. The principal welcomed them warmly and then handed the microphone to Walter. He stood at the front of the room, staring into rows of wide-eyed children and a few tearful teachers. He took a breath, one hand resting on Remy's harness. "I am not here today because I am brave," Walter began. "I am here because I had someone beside me who was braver than most people I've ever met." He paused, glancing at Remy. "This is Remy. He is not just a dog. He is my partner, my protector, my reason. We served together overseas, and when I came home with invisible wounds, post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic pain, fear I couldn't name, Remy stayed. He never flinched, never judged. He saw me on my worst days and stayed anyway." Children sat frozen in rapt attention. One little girl in the front row wiped a tear. Another boy whispered to his friend, "He's like a superhero." Walter chuckled softly. "You know, I used to think dogs just chased sticks and barked at the mailman, but Remy, he chases away nightmares." The auditorium filled with laughter. Then small hands shot up, eager questions spilled over. "Can he do tricks? Was he ever scared? Did he really save you?" Walter answered each question with patience, warmth, and occasional humor. When one shy boy admitted he was afraid of dogs, Walter kneeled and motioned him forward. Remy lay down, his eyes calm, his posture relaxed. The boy hesitated, then reached out, gently touching Remy's head. "He's soft," the boy whispered, "and not scary." "No," Walter said, "he is kind, just like people can be when given a chance." Later that morning, another speaker was introduced, someone unexpected. Captain Mason stepped onto the small stage, his flight uniform replaced with a dark sweater and a simple black ribbon pinned to his chest. He looked nervous. He had not spoken at a public event in years. His voice trembled slightly at first. "I used to believe animals had no place on planes, or in my life," he said. "But I was wrong." He looked out over the crowd, then at Walter and Remy, sitting quietly in the front row. "My brother was also in the service. He died in a field hospital overseas, holding on to a military dog who had been wounded beside him. For a long time, I blamed that dog. I blamed them all. But the truth is, that dog died trying to stay with him, just like Remy stays with Walter." His voice cracked. "Some scars are loud, others are quiet, but healing sometimes looks like 4 legs and a beating heart." Silence fell over the room. Then, slowly, a ripple of applause grew, rising into something deeper. Respect, understanding, love. After the event, Walter and Mason walked together through the park behind the school. The sun was dipping low, casting the sky in brilliant streaks of gold and pink. Remy walked between them, head held high, ears perked, as if listening to the wind itself. "He's more than a dog," Mason said. "He always was," Walter replied. "We just had to stop looking at the leash and start seeing the heart." They walked on in peace. 3 soldiers, past and present, bonded not just by war, but by something older, something gentler. And as they disappeared into the trees, the screen faded to black. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey of loyalty, healing, and quiet courage. Walter and Remy's story reminds us that not all heroes wear uniforms. Some walk beside us, steady and silent, carrying the weight we can no longer bear alone. In the darkest of moments, they do not leave. They lean in, they protect, they save. If this story moved you, made you feel something real, or reminded you of the unspoken bond between humans and the animals who love us, please support us. Subscribe to Amazing Paws Stories for more true stories of bravery, compassion, and the animals who change our lives in ways we never expected. Real animals, real emotions. We tell their stories because they deserve to be heard. Like, share, comment, and never forget, sometimes the quietest hearts leave the loudest echo.